I recognize that water. That's actually a Cognashine Lake. You can tell with the ripples, I think. Well, pleasure to be here and part of the H2O gathering and to be caught up with great friends of mine. I guess I've been involved in a fair amount of way in a long time. I don't go back to 1916, Rupert, but certainly GBA has been very much a part of our life, and now Georgian Bay Forever, and all of the ramifications of the work that they've done. Suddenly I found it in front of me in the new role, or the not so new role, that I've been involved in. Now, this week is particularly important to tell you that I've been described as a member of the International Joint Commission. Joint has nothing to do with marijuana, so don't even get any of your thoughts on it. But I do know this, that Phragmites is very much of a discussion point, and later we're going to hear from David and from Rupert. They have made discoveries about Phragmites that you can't believe. The flower of Phragmites has actually cannabis seed in it. And they're going to be harvesting this as a new way and solve the problem of the shortfall that some of you here have noticed in this past week. So with any luck at all, we'll have an announcement later on that's official and that will no doubt gather the public's interest. Now, you also know that I have something to do with Georgian Bay, with something to do with, in our case, Cognashine Lake, and there are a few folks around here who have are Cognashine infidels that I can immediately see, but we all have this great interest. Mine goes back over 50 years now. I'm an import, and last year I think I reached the 50-year mark, and that means I'm no longer known as Mr. Harriet Walker from Cognashine Lake, but I have my own name, and I'm pleased. That is an accomplishment. I feel that's quite an important accomplishment and all. What I'm going to talk about today has been written out in some of the advanced information that you have, but I too am looking forward to the more detailed discussions that we will see about cage aquaculture, about Phragmites, about nutrients, many of which will come up. So I'm going to kind of focus my thoughts on a little bit of the bigger picture, if I might. And what I hope to do is to be able to go through and talk a little bit about the Great Lakes generally and an assessment that we can make of it, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, how it fits into all of this discussion, and come back into our triennial assessment of progress reports of the parties of the two governments and the 8 states and the 2 provinces that we generally report to. Talk a little bit about microplastics and Phragmites and water levels, our famous subject that we've had for so long, and something of the approach towards the journey's end. Now, a lot of us have a very direct Georgian Bay connection. And what is Georgian Bay? Well, some people call it the 6th Great Lake. And I suppose it would be. I mean, it's 120 miles long and 50 miles wide, so it's a pretty big place. It's 80% of the quantity of Lake Ontario. So it in itself could be a great lake in this whole area. There are 35,000 islands in the Great Lakes, but 30,000 of them are certainly in the area that we know so well. So it's a pretty big area, and it's pretty interesting. But I thought I might offer some thoughts about our greater lake, Great Lake Huron. Lake Huron, of course, is part of a combination lake, Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, as we all know, one and the same lake. So the lakes are very interesting in that if we look at Lake Superior, it's 1,300 feet deep, 1,330 feet deep according to records. But I suppose most of that water's been there for the last 10,000 years, so it was part of the melt, because there's only a 33-foot deep channel that leads away from it. So it's just the top of it that's going to end up being emptied, certainly not parts of it that are really down below. And of course, there are a series of steps that work their way down from Lake Superior. It's a 33-foot drop from Lake Superior to Huron, Michigan. And then it's only 6 feet drop from Lake Huron down to Lake Erie. And when it gets to Niagara, it's a 300-foot drop. So a series of steps. The water cascades down as what generally flows through the connecting channel of Lake St. Clair, or River St. Clair, is about 200,000 cubic feet per second, and that's about the same going over Niagara Falls. 200, think of every second 200,000 pails of water going over. That's an awful lot of water. Then, of course, there's only half the water going over. The other half is diverted underneath to give the power companies something to have during the day to run their turbines. So it's the lakes are very, very interesting lakes, as we all know, and they have some very interesting sides to them. We all know about the fact that it's 21% of the Earth's surface fresh water located in the Great Lakes. Half of it, of course, is located in Lake Superior. It has a coastline that's 10,000 miles, indeed 10,500 miles long, more or less half and half between Canada and the United States. So people have often referred to it as the third coast. The amount of water, just in case you're wondering, is 6 quadrillion gallons of water, or 23 million quadrillion liters. So it's pretty huge. If they emptied the Great Lakes, it would cover the North American continent to the extent of 5 feet. So an awful lot of water is located right at our doorstep, and that we're directly involved in. 44 million people or so drink the waters of the Great Lakes. Here we are, 20-minute walk away from Lake Ontario. Most of us probably live in this area and have been drinking the water for all of our life. If we're not doing it in the wintertime or here in Toronto, we're often doing it in Georgian Bay. So water is very, very important to us. What is it? 85% of the human body is water. So I suppose an awful lot of that is this Great Lake, these Great Lakes, and they're very, very important to us. Georgian Bay, of course, is that part of Lake Huron. I thought I would try and offer some observations on how good it is and how it compares. So, first of all, overall, pretty good. They're not necessarily as great as Superior, but then Superior doesn't have the kinds of cities and growth and agricultural attention to it that we have on Lake Hurons and Lake Michigan. But in any case, pretty darn good. The water, as you know, comes from Superior to get into our area, but it also comes from the rivers that feed in, and there are a myriad of rivers that line the two lakes that we have and that we know very much about in our area of Georgian Bay. And it also comes from the precipitation. Generally speaking, it's about a third each. So that's where it comes from. In terms of the overall quality of Lake Huron, I'll quote there's a report on Lake Huron that's about to becoming public, but basically the general conclusion is rather good. There are currently no areas within the waters of Lake Huron that have significant drinking water impact. Now that's very important because this is required by the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. there were 500,000 through the air, declined since the 70s. We looked at not just chemical integrity, we looked at the physical integrity and the biological integrity. Well, so what's the physical? Well, the physical is surface water temperature. Well, that's not quite so good. That has warmed up a bit since the mid-80s, gone up about 0.05 to 0.6 degrees in each year between 85 and 2009. Ice cover, that's another measure of physical integrity. We all know about the ice cover. It seems, although the last couple of years there have been some pretty impressive ice covers, we know that there's been a substantial decline, 88% decline of ice cover days on Lake Ontario, for instance, a 37% decline on St. Clair and Superior. And Michigan and Lake Huron are about half of what they had in the 70s in terms of days of ice. So those are the measures looked at, but generally speaking, getting much better. Now, in this period of time, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement came into force. And the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement was, first of all, brought about necessity breeds invention. Well, the IJC was calling for this kind of an agreement. In effect, it's a treaty, but countries have, like the United States, have a lot of trouble with treaties these days, and so they call them agreements instead. And so such wonderful partners as former Prime Minister Trudeau and former President Richard Nixon finally had to come together and shake hands in 1972 with the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Why? Because rivers like the Cuyahoga River, the Buffalo River were on fire. How can you have rivers on fire? But they were. And many of us remember those days. Well, fortunately, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement in its first version came out then and has been revised a number of times. In essence, it's a permanent reference to the IJC to be paying attention to and reporting on that. The IJC was established in 1909 under the Boundary Waters Treaty. And there was a word in the Boundary Waters Treaty which is just meant really for water quantity, but it also had the word pollution. First time probably that word's ever turned up in the 20th century in anything. And so that was good, and with that in mind, the IJC started to get directly involved with the Great Lakes themselves. Now we cover all across the border. The border's what, 3,000 miles. It's got. I know that we cover something like 330 lakes, rivers, and streams, including the Great Lakes. So. It's quite a bit to keep on top of, but the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, of course, relates to the Great Lakes. No longer talking just quantity; it talks strictly about water quality, and its purpose, when established, was to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the Great Lakes. And so it introduced principles that included words like accountability, adaptive management, adequate treatment, anti-degradation, coordination, ecosystem approach, innovation, polluter pays, precaution, prevention, public engagement, science-based management, sustainability, tributary management, and virtual elimination and zero discharge, with general objectives and specific objectives on specific lakes. The IJC's job was defined in there as well, and the intention and purpose was to have the IJC act as the person grading the activities of the two governments and the 8 states and the 2 provinces and the various conservation authorities and county health units and like. So the IJC basically has that role. Originally under the Boundary Waters Treaty, now made more specific under this particular, in essence, agreement. There are a variety of annexes under the agreement, and so we look at areas of concern at lake-wide management, chemicals of mutual concern, nutrients, discharges from vessels, aquatic invasive species, groundwater, and climate change impacts. So all of those things are part of it. And every 6 months there's a meeting of the Great Lakes Executive Council, and Rupert and David and others in the room have turned up at those meetings every 6 months. 6 months, usually one in Toronto in December and in Chicago in June. And as they report on various aspects, each one of the annex committees, this executive is made up of 85 people and covers all kinds of organizations, First Nations, tribes, academic, and well, just everyone's included, many government officials. And with that, we try and keep on top of what's going on. And there are, as I say, observers from within here who turn up at those meetings all the time. Part of that Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement required us to produce a triennial report. And so we do that. And our triennial report is well, the agreement is quite lengthy in this respect, but several pages directly relating to what the IJC has to do. But in essence, we are to provide the parties, meaning the government of Canada and the government of the United States, and all of the affiliated governments, with a report on progress every 3 years on what has been done in that period of time. So that is our responsibility. It's a 3-year cycle now. The new agreement, the agreement that was established in 1972, has been revised a number of times, but in 2012 it was totally rewritten, and the new revisions require our triennial assessment to come along. And we produced our first report at the end of 2017 on the basis of the reports put out by the governments in the year 2016. And so we went around the lakes talking to people, submissions, hundreds and hundreds of submissions, many meetings with many people present, and all kinds of access through the internet and even polling. And in essence, we had to commend the government on what they were accomplishing in this. They're not going to, you can't clear the problems up in 3 years. It takes probably a much longer, several cycles in order to get any substantial progress, but certainly in the first while, progress has been made in getting the system in place to achieve an awful lot. It's not the IJC that does the work, it's not the government, it's not even our annex groups that do the work. They don't have any shovels, and they don't have any fish nets, or they don't have anything to solve the problems. It's the governments themselves, and so Environment Canada, in the case of in Ontario, Environment Ontario, all of these groups are the ones required to keep it going. So this is what our triennial report has been able to produce. Now, we've had to look at issues such as algal blooms, and we talked about how there are spot issues. Well, that's a huge problem. As a matter of fact, I would say, and by way of prediction, that the issue of phosphorus and algal blooms is going to be the problem of the coming decade. Every single lake, whether we're talking Quebec, Ontario, they say there are 250,000 lakes in Ontario as yet without names. Every single lake across our countries, both the United States and Canada, have this algal bloom issue caused by the stressors of too much phosphorus going in and causing the algae to bloom to grow. On Lake Erie, it was 5,000 square kilometers, a mat across the western basin, not all that many years ago, as a matter of fact, 2011. At one point, Toledo had to shut down its water system because not only could you not drink the water, you couldn't even touch the water. It was so toxic. That was at one point. So we've had reports on that, and that's certainly taken This toll, it's not as bad in Lake Huron, but we have spots where it's turning up in Lake Huron, issues, and similarly in the other lakes as well. Microplastics is an area that we've been addressing as well, and I'm looking forward to hearing Dr. Washman have some discussion further on that, and well, that'll bring out much, much more detail than certainly we can talk about. Similarly, Phragmites, I think that's later on the agenda, and I think we'll hear far more about that, but we're on top of that and doing what we can to report on it. Nobody ever heard the word just a few years ago, and even to this day, walk out on the street, Young Street here, and ask people about Phragmites, and there won't be likely more than one person in 100 that might know what you're talking about. The other issue has certainly been water levels, and we've had our issues with the St. Clair River on that. I can't say we got anywhere. Truth of the matter is, with the water rising, as it did, of course, in 2013, it went up about 1.5 feet in a very short order, the fastest rise that's happened in the 20th century, and the rise so fast and continuing on to this day, we all know what water levels are like, and I can tell you that I think from the worst days of 2012 and 2013, if the water was down where my toes are, the water is where my chin is. At this moment, it's gone up in essence 5 feet in that entire period of time. That's a phenomenal amount, but most of us know water goes up and goes down. Right now, with water being up, you can't get anybody interested in talking about doing something on the St. Clair River, which Neely has to have something done. I certainly can't get the American people to be interested in it. They're basically, whenever I'm raising it now, I think I finally got a letter from the Department of State and the External Affairs, not to me personally, but written to us and say, don't raise this again. We're having our trouble getting any trackage on that one, not getting anywhere at all. So, big issues. I'm reaching the end of my journey. In another month and a half, my term is expired. I'm a realist. I'm not going to be reappointed. But I've had 6 years as a chairman of it, and I had 3 years back in the 90s. What I can tell you is that I don't think Georgian Bay has been represented on the International Joint Commission in the past, and it's been a privilege to be on it, and I think Georgian Bay Association and Forever, and indeed all of the organizations have taught me a great deal. What I've taken has come often from our own bit. I mean, who heard anything about Phragmites until David was conducting his seminars all up and down the lake, and anyway, we've now brought it to a head, and it's now very much a part of the lexicon of the International Joint Commission, to the point where a bunch of us were riding in a car, and commissioners, and they got to be a joke and saying, there are Phragmites in the center of the road. So we had lots of those things. Lots of things that I learned from Cognachine Lake, where we are, and it's really not a lake, it's a bay, but where we are, we learned those things, and they applied to the reports of the IJC relating to Toledo and its issues at the Western Basin. Similarly with water levels, and all I can say is that at this moment we've argued these issues at the highest levels of government, with governors, with premiers, with ministers, with the Department of State, with the Department of External Affairs in Canada. At least these issues have been brought to their attention, and so in that respect, it's been quite a ride, and I'm getting to the end of it, but it was quite some time, and at least I can say that your issues, our issues, have had a voice at the highest levels of government. So with that, let me terminate and let somebody else get up here.